What's up everyone, welcome back to the Carnarium. I'm Waste and I have another Commander deck tech for you today. Today we're going to be breaking down Florian, Voldaren Scion. If you're a fan of the channel, you know that I love Rakdos and all the different Rakdos sub-archetypes. One of the coolest and I think the most unique ones in Commander is Group SLUG. So if you're familiar with Group Hug, this is sort of the opposite of that, where Group Hug aims to help out all of its opponents by giving each of them cards and resources. Group SLUG does the opposite by taking away everyone's resources and draining all of their life. But before we get into that, if you like this kind of content, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more of it. Check out the channel Discord in the description if you're interested in talking Magic with other people from the channel. And before you're done watching, leave a comment down below. So with that out of the way, let me give Florian a quick read. Florian is a 3-mana, 1 generic Rakdos commander, Vampire Noble, first strike. At the beginning of your post-combat main phase, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the total amount of life your opponents lost this turn. Exile one of those cards, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may play the exiled card this turn. So a normal Group SLUG deck tries to punish every action the opponent takes. They play a land, they take damage. They play a creature, they take damage. A creature dies, they take damage. Everything they do causes them to lose life. This Group SLUG deck is a little bit different because instead of having all these actions happen whenever our opponents do anything, with Florian, we're trying to have all the life loss and damage happen in the first half of our turn between our upkeep and combat step. That way we get full benefit of Florian's ability to dig through the top X cards of our library. And as you'll see with this first section of the deck, which I'm going to call Pain Inflicters, these cards cause damage and life loss on our turn. A couple of them don't, like Cedh Parasite here, which I'm going to explain in a second. But these cards are in the deck just to punish people who draw way too many cards or crack way too many treasures or things like that. So Cedh Parasite is a 1 black mana horror. Whenever an opponent draws a card, if you control red permanent, you may have Cedh Parasite deal 1 damage to that player. So, like I was explaining, this one doesn't deal damage in the first half of our turn. It deals damage whenever an opponent draws a card, as long as we have red permanent, which we will because half our deck is red permanents, including our commander. But if you've played many games of Commander, you'll know that there's always at least one player, if not two, that try to draw half their deck and just dirtle around drawing cards. So this card really punishes those players because if they try to draw half their deck, they're going to take 50 damage. Moving on to the next card in the Pain Inflictor category, Spear Spewer is a 1 red Goblin Warrior with Defender. We can tap it. Spear Spewer does 1 damage to each player. So it does damage to us, but that's sort of in line with the Group SLUG mentality. We're kind of causing chaos and going down with the ship. But this card works really well with Florian because we can tap Spear Spewer in our first half of our turn and deal 3 damage to each opponent, which allows us to look at the top 3 cards of our library with Florian. So you'll see later that there's a couple of these pinger type of cards where we just tap them and do 1 damage to each opponent. But if we have a couple of them down, it can really start to add up quick. Next card, we have Warlock class, which is a 1 black. This is a multi-tiered class enchantment, so I'll go over each level. First level is at the beginning of your end step. If a creature died this turn, each opponent loses 1 life. So this doesn't really work with Florian, although it does drain our opponents, but it happens after the first half of our turn, so we don't get any benefit with Florian's ability. For 2 mana, we can upgrade this to level 2, and we get, when this class becomes level 2, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of them in your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So after this comes down, at some point later, we can either do it right away if we have the mana or later on. We can look at the top 3 cards, put 1 in our hand, the rest in our graveyard. This is just a nice little way to look through our deck. Sometimes we need a little bit of card advantage, and this provides it in a pinch. But the real reason why this card is in the deck is because of level 3. So for 7 mana, we can upgrade it to level 3. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the life they lost this turn. Now again, this doesn't work with Florian directly. However, this doubles all of the life loss that we're already causing. And as you'll see with the rest of this deck, there's a potential to cause a ton of life loss. And this particular level of this enchantment can combo with another card in our deck and cause everyone to lose all of their life in 1 turn. Up next, we have Creeping Bloodsucker, which is a 2 mana, 1 in a black vampire. At the beginning of your upkeep, Creeping Bloodsucker does 1 damage to each opponent. You gain life equal to the damage dealt this way. This card is an all-star in the deck. It's another one of those passive pingers. This one we don't have to tap though, which is kind of nice, and we gain life. And if you read the wording on this carefully, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, but we also gain 3 life because we gain life equal to the damage dealt this way. Having incremental life gain in this deck is really key. Because we're going to do a lot of damage to everyone and sometimes including ourselves, having a way to gain some of that life back makes it so that we offset the SLUG in Group SLUG. Next up, we have Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. So for red and a black, this is a legendary Elder Giant. It's one of the Escape Elder Giants from Theros. When Kroxa enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it escaped. Whenever Kroxa enters the battlefield or attacks, each opponent discards a card. Then each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card this way loses 3 life. And then we can escape it for double black, double red. We exile 5 other cards from our graveyard and we can bring it back as the 6/6. And every time we attack, we get that same ability. So more often than not in a game of Commander, this is going to come down for 2 mana. It's going to deal 3 damage to each opponent because they're not going to want to discard a non-land. And then we'll be able to look at the top 9 cards of our library with Florian. And then if we bring this back as the 6/6, every time we attack, we get the same thing. So each turn we can do the same thing. Next up, we have Limb Duel's Hex, 1 in a black, enchantment. During your upkeep, Limb Duel's Hex deals 1 damage to each player. Each player may pay 1 black mana or 3 generic mana to prevent this damage to himself or herself. So this is another passive pinger. Again, the more of these we have on the battlefield, the more they stack up, the more crazy Florian's ability gets. Next up, I think you all know this card, Orcish Bowmasters, the bane of Modern. 1 in a black. It is an Orc Archer with Flash. When Orcish Bowmasters enters the battlefield, and whenever an opponent draws a card except for the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, Orcish Bowmasters deals 1 damage to any target, then we amass Orcs 1. That's a lot of text. If you're familiar with the card, you know what this does. You can skip on to the next card. If you're unfamiliar, this essentially comes down at flash speed, so we can cast it anytime we can cast an instant. It gives us a 1/1 body right away. Then we deal 1 damage to any target. So if we do this in the first half of our turn, that's 1 damage already that we can do to someone's face. And then we get the static ability of whenever an opponent draws a card except for the first card they drew in their turn, this deals 1 damage to any target, and we amass Orcs 1. So this card can kind of go crazy. It depends on what the opponents do, but against an opponent that's trying to draw a bunch of cards, let's say they're trying to draw 5 cards, which is pretty modest in Commander. We flash an Orcish Bowmasters, we deal 5 damage to any target, we can split that up however we want, and then we amass Orcs 5, so we create a 5/5 body. So Orcish Bowmasters doesn't directly work with Florian, but it does ping our opponent's faces or ping down their creatures, and creates us a giant body that we can attack with and do damage with. Next up, this is an all-star on the deck, Price of Progress, 1 in a red, instant. Price of Progress deals damage to each player equal to twice the number of non-basic lands that player controls. There's a lot of greedy mana bases out there in Commander. There's some people who are running 0 basic lands in their decks. So let's paint this picture. Each opponent has 10 lands. They have mostly non-basic lands, maybe they have a couple basics. Let's say they each have 8 non-basics and 2 basics. Price of Progress comes down and does 16 damage to each of them. That's oftentimes enough damage to just outright kill someone. But even if we don't kill them, we just did 48 damage to the table. So we get to look at the top 48 cards of our library with Florian and pick the best card and cast it that turn. Really, really good card in the deck. Insane for 2 mana. Next up, we have Rakdos Charm for black and red. This is a modal instant, so we can choose one of these abilities, exile all cards from a target player's graveyard, destroy target artifact, or each creature deals 1 damage to its controller. All of these modes are relevant, which is why Rakdos Charm is such a good card. But the reason why it's in the deck is because of the third mode, where each creature deals 1 damage to its controller. There's usually one deck at the table that is a heavy creature deck, or a token deck that's trying to go very wide and they're making a bunch of creatures or casting a bunch of creatures. Nothing's funnier than a go wide creature deck casting a Craterhoof Behemoth trying to win the game, and at instant speed you play Rakdos Charm and kill them on the spot before they even get to combat. So we can use this as a reactionary spell to save our skin, or we can use it in the first half of our turn to deal a ton of damage to the table and look at a ton of cards with Florian's ability. Next, we have Sanctum of Stone Fangs. This is a 1 in a black legendary enchantment shrine. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of shrines you control. So this makes each of our opponents lose 1 life, and we gain 1 life because we only have 1 shrine. If we had more shrines in the deck, it would do even more, but we only have 1 shrine in the deck, so this is only ever going to do 1 to each opponent. But again, stacked with the rest of our pingers, it's really, really good. And I forgot to mention before, the reason why pingers are important in the deck is because we don't have to use mana on our turn in order to do damage or make our opponents lose life. So on a turn where we want to use Florian's ability, we have all the mana from all our lands to use for our second main phase where we actually get to cast that card. Next card is Stormfist Crusader, black and a red. Creature Human Knight with Menace. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws a card and loses 1 life. Just another pinger that stacks up with all of our other pingers, and it helps us draw a card. We are giving resources to our opponents, but they're probably going to die before they get to use them. Next up is Thermo Alchemist, 1 in a red. This is another pinger. As Defender, tap Thermo Alchemist deals 1 damage to each opponent. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, untap Thermal Alchemist. We do have a couple instants and sorceries in the deck, so it's not uncommon that we get to activate this maybe twice in a turn, maybe 3 times if we're really lucky, but mainly it's just in here to be another pinger. Next up, Tunnel Ignis, 1 in a red. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player had another land enter the battlefield under his or her control this turn, Tunnel Ignis deals 3 damage to that player. So this is to punish the big ramp decks. Land ramp decks are the most powerful decks in the format of Commander. Whether it's your Simic Value Engine decks or your green ramp decks, any deck that's ramping out tons of lands is a huge problem for the table, and it's almost impossible to deal with their strategy because mass land destruction is frowned upon. So this is a way to punish them for land ramping. Every land that they ramp deals 3 damage to them. Next up, we have Vengeful Tracker, 1 in a red. Whenever an opponent sacrifices an artifact, Vengeful Tracker deals 2 damage to them. So this is to punish the treasure decks. It can also be a tool to punish artifact decks because artifact decks tend to sacrifice a lot of artifacts to gain value. This card puts those artifact decks in a bind because they have to get rid of it before they start cracking all their treasures, or they start sacrificing all their artifacts to case the eye. Next up, we have Descent into Avernus. This is an all-star on the deck, one of my favorite cards. 2 in a red enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, put 2 descent counters on Descent into Avernus. Then each player creates X treasure tokens, and Descent into Avernus deals X damage to each player, where X is the number of descent counters on Descent into Avernus. So the way this card works is on my upkeep, we put 2 descent counters on it. Let's say that this is the first turn where we get an activation from this card. So it deals 2 damage to each player, and we each create 2 treasure tokens. The next turn, we put 2 more descent counters on it and deals 4 damage to each player, and we each create 4 treasure tokens. So not only does this deal a ton of damage to our opponents passively for us, but it also gives everyone a ton of mana, which speeds up the game. And if you're doing the math, 2 damage to each player is 6. So on the first turn when this activates, we're already doing 6 damage to each opponent. We get to look at the top 6 cards of our library with Florian. On the next turn, we're doing 4 to each opponent. That's 12 cards. And it just gets bigger and bigger from there. Next up, we have Loyal Subordinate, 2 in a black, zombie with menace, Lieutenant. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control your commander, each opponent loses 3 life. This is like a super pinger because this is making each of our opponents lose 3 life. And so on its own, it's dealing 9 to each opponent each turn. Next up, we have Plague Spitter. For 2 in a black, at the beginning of your upkeep, Plague Spitter deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. When Plague Spitter dies, Plague Splitter deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. This is in the deck because not only is it a pinger, but it deals damage to each creature. So this can get rid of a lot of pesky creatures on our opponent's side of the board, especially if they're running a lot of 1/1s or mana dorks or anything with 1 toughness. There's a lot of really annoying 1 toughness creatures out there, like Thalia or Esper Sentinel, and it's just nice to be able to get rid of those every single turn. Next, we have Sin Prodder, 2 in a red, with Menace. At the beginning of your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library. Any opponent may have you put that card into your graveyard. If that player does, Sin Prodder deals damage to that player equal to that card's converted mana cost. Otherwise, put that card into your hand. So Sin Prodder provides us pseudo card draw. An opponent may choose to put in our graveyard if it's a spell they don't want us to have, but more often than not, the spells they don't want us to have are big mana spells. And since this deck is already doing so much damage to them, they may not have a choice but to let us draw it. Because if they're already really low on life, and they're looking at putting a 7 mana spell in our graveyard, they may not have the ability to take 7 more damage. So this is just another card that puts our opponents in a bind, which is the whole point of this deck. Next up, we have Urbrass Forge. Standard All-Star. 2 in a red artifact. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put an oil counter on Urbrass Forge, then create an X1 red Phyrexian horror creature token with trample and haste, where X is the number of oil counters on Urbrass Forge. Sacrifice that token at the beginning of the next end step. This card basically gives us a free X1. If we get this card down early, say turn 3, then that X1 gets huge over the course of the game. We don't care about it dying because it's going to sacrifice itself anyway at the end of the turn, so we're always going to swing at an opponent with this, and it has trample, so it's basically always going to connect. So this card gives us free damage to an opponent and could be a political tool where I can choose not to attack someone that's vulnerable if they give me some sort of benefit, like not attacking me back for the next turn cycle. Next, we have Court of Ambition, 2 black enchantment. When Court of Ambition enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. Real quick, I love cards that give people the Monarch. I think the Monarch is one of the best mechanics in Commander. It incentivizes people to attack each other. It's just a really fun way to sort of change the dynamic of a game and break the ice if people don't want to attack each other because they're worried about hurting someone's feelings or they don't want to upset a player. This changes everything because everyone wants to draw cards, so everyone wants the Monarch. So at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card. If you're the Monarch, instead, each opponent loses 6 life unless they discard 2 cards. So this comes down, gives us the Monarch, so we get to draw an extra card at the end of our turn. More than likely, someone's going to try to steal the Monarch, which is expected, and it's not the worst thing in the world, because whoever has the Monarch is sort of the target of the table, like I was just explaining. Court of Ambition still makes our opponents lose life, even if we don't have the Monarch. If we do have the Monarch, it deals twice as much life loss, unless they choose to discard 2 cards, but almost no one's going to want to discard 2 cards from their hand. Just adds to the chaos of the board state that we're trying to create with this deck. Next up, we have Pestilence, which is 2 black. It's an enchantment. At the end of each turn, if no creatures are in play, sacrifice Pestilence. We can pay black, and Pestilence deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. This card is flexible because we can choose how much mana we want to pump into this. If we need to get rid of a bunch of creatures on the board, we can pump more mana into it, and it'll deal a bunch of damage to each player, but it'll kill the creatures that we want it to kill. If we want to just ping people, we can just do 1 mana. The trick with Pestilence is trying to not kill all the creatures on the table because we don't want to get rid of it. Now, there are some times where that's just inevitable. We got to wipe the board, and so it'll sacrifice itself at the end of the turn. But if you can, try to kill all but 1 creature, all with the highest, whatever the highest toughness creature is, as long as that creature is not some huge threat. But let's say your opponent has like a 0/5 wall. You can deal 4 damage to each creature, which will more than likely kill everything on the table, and that one opponent gets to keep their 0/5 wall, and it doesn't really matter. And we get to keep our Pestilence. Next up, we have my favorite creature in Magic the Gathering, Phyrexian Obliterator. So this is a quad black creature horror with trample. Whenever a source deals damage to Phyrexian Obliterator, that source's controller sacrifices that many permanents. So this card is flexible. Kind of depends on the board state. If we're facing down a couple of aggro opponents, this comes down and basically halts the battlefield. No one's going to want to attack us because we're just going to block their biggest power creature and make them sack that many permanents. If they're trying to swing in with a 12/12, well, guess what? Now you're going to sacrifice 12 permanents. If we don't have a bunch of aggro opponents, we can start attacking them with Phyrexian Obliterator and get 5 damage each turn because no one's going to want to block it. So I like that in this deck we can use this defensively or offensively depending on the situation. Next up, we have Rankle, Master of Pranks, 2 black. It is a legendary creature, fairy rogue, flying haste. Whenever Rankle, Master of Pranks deals combat damage to a player, choose any number of the following abilities. So each player discards a card, each player loses 1 life and draws a card, each player sacrifices a creature. So as you can see, I like flexible spells in my decks because there's a lot of different kinds of scenarios we come across in Commander, and it's nice to have something that helps us deal with different kinds of situations. So Rankle, with the first mode, we can cause people to discard cards. We don't really care about discarding cards because Florian creates card advantage through exile. So the card that we get through Florian is invulnerable to being discarded. The second mode, each player loses 1 life and draws a card, is the one we're going to use the most often because that's allowing us to ping each player and it allows us to draw a card, but we get more damage in the first half of our turn with that ability, plus the damage we already did with Rankle by attacking someone and dealing combat damage. So this is giving us 6 damage to put towards Florian's ability. And then the each player sacrifices a creature ability is pretty relevant because if someone's a Voltron deck, we can make them sacrifice their commander and get rid of that huge 20/20 that's trying to swing at us. Or if someone has only a couple creatures on the board and both those creatures are scary, they have to choose one of them and get rid of them. We have a lot of creatures that we don't mind sacrificing. The deck doesn't revolve around sacrificing, but we have a lot of like little pingers and stuff that we don't mind getting rid of if it's for the greater good. So Rankle is a nice, versatile Swiss Army knife in the deck. Next up, we have another all-star in the deck, Twilight Prophet. For 2 black, it's a Vampire Cleric with flying, ascend. So if we have 10 or more permanents, we get the City's Blessing, which is a little emblem saying that we have ascend now. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you have the City's Blessing, reveal the top card of your library and put it into your hand. Each opponent loses X life, and you gain X life, where X is that card's mana value. So we will oftentimes have the City's Blessing because, as you can see, most of our cards are permanents in this deck. A lot of them are enchantments or artifacts or creatures, so it's not going to be hard for us to get the City's Blessing. So as long as we have that, Twilight Prophet activates each upkeep, and we draw an extra card, essentially. Everyone gets to see it. And depending on the mana value of that card, each opponent loses life equal to that mana value, and we gain life equal to that mana value. if we flip over a 7 mana value spell, each of our opponents loses 7 life and we gain 7 life. The worst thing that can happen is we flip a land, so no one loses any life and we don't gain any life, but we did draw an extra card that turn. So even in the worst case scenario, we're still drawing an extra card and it's super good. So like I said, this card's an all-star because it's card advantage and draining our opponents at the same time. Next up, we have Balor, another pet favorite of mine in the deck. As you can tell, I have a lot of pet favorites in this deck, which is why it's probably my favorite deck to play. Balor is a 5 mana, 3 generic red demon with flying. Whenever Balor attacks or dies, choose one or more. Each mode must target a different player. The first mode is target opponent draws 3 cards, then discards 3 cards at random. The second mode is target opponent sacrifices a non-token artifact. And the third mode is Balor deals damage to target opponent equal to the number of cards in their hand. So this is another example of a modal card. It does a bunch of different things, but it's also a 5/5 flying beater. So the reason I like it so much in this deck is because it's evasive, it's a flyer. So you can imagine we go in, we attack with Balor, it's a 5/5, we get a trigger on the stack during our attack phase. So we can choose one or more of these modes. The first two kind of just depend on what's going on, but making someone draw 3 and discard 3 at random is pretty funny because discarding 3 cards at random can be really rough for an opponent. It doesn't really matter what their hand is. The chance of them discarding something that they want to keep at random is pretty high. And we can also make another opponent sacrifice a non-token artifact. That could be any kind of artifact out there, like a One Ring, which is indestructible, but this gets around that because it makes them sacrifice it. Or anything else that's big and scary. There's lots of scary artifacts out in Commander. But it's the third mode that we really care about the most. So we typically want to target the player with the most cards in hand, right? The table's usually cool with that because the person with the most cards in hand is more than likely the threat of the table. So let's say that person has, a Reliquary Tower down or a Thought Vessel, something that keeps their hand size unlimited. Let's just say they're a Simic Value Engine, they have 15 cards in hand. Balor can target them and deal 15 damage to their face. Then depending on who we were attacking with Balor, if it's that same opponent, then we're gonna do another 5 damage to them. So that's 20 damage total. Or maybe it's another opponent, we're spreading it around and we deal 5 damage to them, but that's still 20 damage total. So this card can deal a ton of damage in one combat step on its own, and that's not including all the other cards that we talked about that might be stacked up with it. So as you're starting to see, this deck can do a ton of damage in one turn. It can make people lose a ton of life in one turn. And so sometimes with Florian, we're looking at the top 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 cards of our library and handpicking the best one for that given board state. Next up, Pauper All-Star, Grey Merchant of Asphodel, Gary. 3 black. When Grey Merchant of Asphodel enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, where X is your devotion to black. You gain life equal to the life lost this way. So this card can create a ton of life loss. As you can tell already, we have a ton of permanents in this deck, and a lot of them have black pips in them, including our commander. So minimum, Grey Merchant of Asphodel comes down, it makes each opponent lose 2 life, and so we would gain 6. But in reality, this usually comes down mid to late game, and it makes each opponent lose 10 life, and we gain 30. So this card can come down and cause a big swing in everyone's life total, and allow us to look at a ton of cards with Florian. Next up, we have Heartless Hitsugu. This is a 5 mana, 3 red, legendary creature Ogre Shaman. We can tap Heartless Hitsugu and it deals damage to each player equal to half that player's life total rounded down. So this card obviously does a ton of damage. If we tap this, we can make each player lose half their life, including us. In a game of Commander, everyone has 40 life. Best case scenario, we're making everyone lose 20 life, so that's 60 cards that we'd be able to look at with Florian's ability. More often than not, when this comes down, everyone's not going to have 40 life exactly, but it's still going to do a ton of damage to everyone, and we might be able to look at the top 30 cards, the top 40 cards. It's still a ton of cards. However, if we have a Wound Reflection or a Warlock class type effect down, then this just kills everyone at the end of our turn. Because we did damage to everyone equal half their life, and then those cards make them lose that amount of life again. So this card can either work as a really fast clock on the table, or a 2-card combo with other cards in our deck to just kill the whole table outright. Next up, we have Palace Siege, 3 black, enchantment. As Palace Siege enters the battlefield, choose Khans or Dragons. Khans at the beginning of your upkeep, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Or Dragons at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Obviously, more often than not, we're going to choose the second mode, but every once in a while I choose the cons mode because we have enough pingers down, and it's actually more beneficial to start getting creatures back from our graveyard. So either mode is usable, it just depends on where we're at in the game. But again, I like cards that are flexible, which makes this card good in the deck. Next up, we have Quakebringer, 3 red. It is a giant berserker. Your opponents can't gain life, so that's key. If we're playing against a life gain deck, that shuts them down. If we're playing against another deck that maybe has a bunch of lifelink creatures or has some other form of incremental life gain, it turns that off. Obviously, life gain is the weakness of this deck, so we really don't want our opponents to gain life. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, Quakebringer deals 2 damage to each opponent. This ability triggers only if Quakebringer is on the battlefield or if Quakebringer is in your graveyard and you control the giant. We can also foretell this card, so early game we can pay 2 mana, foretell it, and then pay 2 red on another turn and bring it out of foretell and cast it that way instead of paying 5 mana. So we can cast it a little bit earlier if we want. Next up we have Soul of New Phyrexia. This is a 6 mana generic artifact creature avatar. We can pay 5 generic mana, permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn. Or we can pay 5 mana, exile Soul of New Phyrexia from our graveyard, and permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn. This card can either be a 6/6 trampling beater, which again is great with Florian's ability, or in the mid to late game can allow us to survive a board wipe, or some type of Ondu Inversion, Hour of Revelation type effect. In Rakdos, we're kind of weak to those types of wraths that blow up everything. We don't really care about creature wraths in this deck. It will hurt us, but it won't completely shut down our deck because a lot of our stuff is artifacts and enchantments. But an all-out, destroy all non-land permanent type effect will blow us out most of the time. So having a way to protect ourselves stapled onto the back of a big creature is nice. And then even if Soul of New Phyrexia dies, if it's in our graveyard, we can actually activate this ability again by paying 5 mana and exiling it. So we kind of get 2 chances with this card. We either get to do it while it's on the battlefield, or if it ends up in our graveyard somehow, we get to do it again. And then last, but definitely not least, is Wound Reflection. So for 5 and a black, this is an enchantment that says at the end of each turn, each opponent loses life equal to the life he or she lost this turn. And this is like what I was explaining before with Warlock class. It does the same thing if we get it to level 3, and it combos with a lot of stuff in our deck, but especially with Heartless Hitsugu, where we can make everyone lose half their life and then make them lose half their life again. Now I know some of you are already thinking this, so I'm just going to say it, but with Heartless Hitsugu's ability, it does say rounded down. So if we do half of someone's life total rounded down, if they have an odd life total, that doesn't exactly kill them with Wound Reflection, but we have so many other pingers on the battlefield that more often than not, the combo plus whatever other pingers we have kills them outright. So on to the next section of the deck. I'm going to call this engine support. So the engine being the pain inflictors, causing a bunch of damage to everyone, making everyone lose a bunch of life. These are the cards that kind of help that engine work. So first up we have the MDFC Malika Rebirth, 1 black, it's an instant, choose target creature, you lose 2 life until end of turn. That creature gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. This is just a great card in general, helps protect our commander or some other creature we want to protect. It's an MDFC, so if we need to play it as a land, we can, but it protects us from targeted removal or a board wipe where we want to protect 1 creature. So next up we have Cranial Archive. It's a 2 mana generic artifact with pay 2 mana, exile Cranial Archive, target player shuffles his or her graveyard into his or her library, draw a card. So the reason why this is in the deck is just as a situational piece, maybe against a mill player where all of our stuff is ending up in our graveyard, maybe against a player that just cast a non-land permanent wrath like Hour of Revelation, and we want to get those cards back in our library. It helps us reset against a couple different kinds of all-out board wipes and make sure that we're not completely out of the game in those types of situations. And then worst case scenario, if we don't need it to save us from some type of catastrophe that happened during the game, we can just shuffle our graveyard back in our library and draw a card. So it works as card advantage as well. Next up we have a super all-star in this deck in Cryptborn Horror. So this card is a 1 generic hybrid Rakdos creature horror with trample. Cryptborn Horror enters the battlefield with X+1/+1 counters on it, where X is the total life lost by your opponents this turn. So as we discussed in the first section of the deck, it's not hard for this deck to do 30 plus damage to our opponents. So a lot of the times this 3 mana creature comes down as a 30/30 trampler. This becomes an immediate must remove creature for our opponents, and it takes the focus off of us and puts it on our creature. And if they can't remove it, it basically just kills someone the next turn, and we get all that damage to use towards Florian's ability. Next up, we have Voldaren Scion of War. This is a really fun card to use as a commander in its own right, but in this deck it's pretty good too. It's a 1 black-red legendary creature, human wizard with menace. We can tap it to make spells we cast this turn that are black or red cost X less to cast, where X is the amount of life you've lost this turn, activate only as a sorcery. It's kind of a bummer that it's activate only as a sorcery. Makes it more vulnerable, but it would be totally broken if it wasn't activate only as a sorcery, so I kind of get why Wizards designed it that way. But as we discussed before, a lot of the pingers and other type of life loss effects that we have in the deck also affect us. So Rowan allows us to take that incremental damage and life loss that we're doing to ourselves and turn it into card discounts. Even doing 1 damage to ourselves in a turn and discounting all our red and black spells by 1 is huge. That could be the difference between casting 1 spell a turn or casting 2 very impactful spells in 1 turn. Next up, we got Theater of Horrors. This is a 1 black-red enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. During your turn, if an opponent lost life this turn, you may play lands and cast spells from among cards exiled with Theater of Horrors. And then we can pay 3 in a red. Theater of Horrors deals 1 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. So with that last ability, this card can activate itself, but obviously in the shell of this deck, we're going to be causing our opponents to lose a bunch of life anyway. So basically this just turns into 1 extra card per turn that we can choose to cast or not cast. This card is great on turn, allows us to essentially do a pseudo Phyrexian Arena where we're drawing an extra card per turn, but it sort of gives those cards a pseudo protection because it's keeping them in exile and not in our hand. Of course, if someone gets rid of this enchantment, then all those cards remain in exile and we can't cast them, but more often than not, people aren't trying to get rid of this thing, and it just gives us an extra card each turn. Next up, we have really solid MDFC Valakut Awakening, 2 in a red. It's an instant, put any number of cards from your hand on the bottom of your library, then draw that many cards +1. Just a really good self-wheel. Sometimes our hand is just not what we need in that given moment, and we'd much rather shuffle it away and draw that many +1 cards. Almost every time I cast this thing, it's absolutely worth it to just chuck my hand and get a brand new hand, and it's nice that it doesn't put it in our graveyard, it puts it back into our library, so we can still get those cards back later with Florian's ability if we dig deep enough. Next up is Rakdos, Lord of Riots. This is a pretty infamous commander in its own right. Double black, double red, legendary creature demon. You can't cast this spell unless an opponent lost life this turn. Not a problem for this deck. It has flying and trample. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each 1 life your opponent's lost this turn. As we talked about before, this deck is dealing a ton of damage and making our opponents lose a ton of life. So now all of our creatures are discounted that much, kind of like Rowan, but only for creatures. But even on its own, this card is a flying, trampling 6/6. So even without the discount ability, it's still going to get through pretty much anyone's defenses and deal a ton of damage every turn. Next up, we have Wild Magic Sorcerer. This is a 3 generic 1 red creature, Orc Shaman. The first spell you cast from exile each turn has Cascade. Obviously, Florian's ability puts all of our spells in exile before we can cast them. So now all of those spells have Cascade. It essentially gives us double spells each time we cast something from exile. As we saw with Theater of Horrors, we have other spells that give us card advantage from exile as well. So not only Florian, but other cards in the deck allow us to trigger this clause and get Cascade from our exiled spells. It's just really good card advantage. Obviously, casting 2 spells in 1 turn is better than 1 spell in a turn. Not to mention, this is a 4/3, so we can still attack with this thing and usually get in and get some damage. Next up, we have Exquisite Blood, or as my version is, Hunger of the Ancient One. So this is a 5 mana, 4 generic 1 black enchantment that says whenever an opponent loses life, we gain that much life. There are a ton of decks, especially aristocrat decks, that try to combo with this card, and I'm not playing it that way. I don't think there's a single card in this deck that combos with it. I'm literally using it as life gain. I'm really only using it for the life gain, I promise. Pinky swear. Sometimes it's a hard task to sell the table on that, but it's actually the truth. This deck deals so much damage to everyone that it's nice to gain all that life back for each damage we're dealing. So this deck is already doing a ton of damage, and most of that damage is pointed at our opponents. So that separates our life total from their life total because they're losing life at a much faster rate than we are. However, that does make us a target sometimes because people sort of realize that we're the ones that's causing them to lose, even if it is indirectly. So it's nice to have life gain in the deck, even though this is sort of a scary combo piece life gain in most scenarios. But now it turns all of that life loss we're dealing to everyone into life gain for us. So if we deal 30 damage to the table, we gain 30 life. And it really starts to put a separation between our life total and the table's life total. And it combos really well with cards like Descent into Avernus, because now, as that card ticks up and everyone's losing life, even though we're losing that much life, we gain all the life that everyone else lost. So we're really offsetting our own life loss with 3 times that much life gain. So obviously this card's really good in the deck. It's not something that I would recommend playing in the beginning of the game because people freak out and they want to kill you immediately. But if you're already in a kind of controlling state with this game and everyone's kind of scrambling to figure out how they're going to survive, and then you plop this down mid to late game, it can pretty much be game over from there because there's no way that they can deal enough damage to you in enough time before they die. And that's really why the card's in the deck. It's really just to kind of put that final foot on the face of our opponents. Next up, we have MDFC, Song Mat Treachery. 3 red, gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn. It's just a nice little value MDFC in the deck. I most of the time play this as the land, but every once in a while there's a really scary creature that's funny to take control of, like a Galta, which is like a 12/12 trampler, and just kill someone with it, and then we gain a ton of value off of that attack because now we just did 12 damage to an opponent, we get to look at another 12 cards with Florian, and the opponent that controlled that creature might not be playing anymore, so we don't really have to worry about giving it back to them. It's a fun, versatile card in the deck. I like cards that take other people's stuff and uses it against them. Commander is full of really powerful creatures, so it's never a bad idea to take the most powerful creature on the board. You can even use it politically. You can say, hey, can I borrow your creature to go attack the problem player at the table? And sometimes people will be okay with that as long as you make a deal with them or you promise to not attack them or something like that. So think of this as mainly a land, but in a pinch it can be a really cool spell to finish someone off or have a big turn. And then last but certainly not least, one of my favorite cards of all time. If I could play this as a commander, I would. It's Sire of Insanity. 4 generic, black-red, creature demon. At the beginning of each end step, each player discards his or her hand. Now, wait, I know what you're thinking. Why would you ever play this card? Well, think about it. Florian creates card advantage through exile, not through our hand. So yes, we will have to discard our hand, but since we are the ones playing this card, we're aware of that and we'll play it at the right opportune time. We're not going to cast this when we have 7 cards in hand and we lose our whole hand. Not unless we really need to because someone else has 30 cards in hand. What we're really going to do is wait until we have like 1 or 2 cards in hand, they're useless, maybe it's a mana rock and a land, or some other type of non-applicable spell that we don't care about losing. And now it turns the game into a funny state of everyone's top decking, trying to answer this card / all the other stuff that we're doing, and we're still getting extra card advantage every turn with Florian's ability. So Sire of Insanity isn't just everyone loses their hand at the end of each turn, it cripples the entire table into having 0 resources to answer our board state. All while we get to gain card advantage with Florian and hand select the spells we want from the top of our deck, depending on how much damage and life loss we're doing to the table. It's incredibly brutal, you're not wrong, but that's the whole point of this deck. Put the entire table between a rock and a hard place, where it really doesn't matter what choice they make. Like I said, if I could, I would play this card as my commander. You should all be thankful that I can't. Okay, so on to the next section of the deck. We're going to call this the protection section. There's only a couple cards in here, but they're really important to making sure we don't die before we get to execute the game plan of this deck. So first up we have Smoke. Smoke is an enchantment, 2 red. It says no player may untap more than 1 creature on each of their untap steps. So this card is super good against go wide creature strategies, or any other kind of deck that's trying to beat people down. It restricts them to 1 creature. It is vulnerable to abilities like Vigilance because those creatures don't tap when they attack, but in pretty much any other kind of attack strategy deck, the creatures have to tap and therefore they cannot untap except for 1 on each of their untap steps. Really cripples aggro creature strategies. Next we have Mudslide, which is 2 and a red. Creatures without flying do not untap during their controller's untap phase. At the end of his or her upkeep, each player may pay an additional 2 mana per creature to untap a creature without flying he or she controls. So this works very similarly to Smoke, except it affects only non-flying creatures. And it puts a tax on all of them, so if a player wants to untap it during their untap step, they have to pay 2 mana. So this isn't going to stop someone from untapping 1 or 2 creatures per turn, but it is going to use their mana to do it, and it is going to stop go-wide creature decks from being able to untap everything every turn. Next up we have Carter Doomscourge, 2 black-red. When Carter Doomscourge enters the battlefield until your next turn, creatures your opponents control attack each combat if able, and attack a player other than you if able. Whenever an attacking creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. So that last clause there causes life loss, so that's nice for our deck, and it gains us life, but really this is in the deck to come down and goad all of our opponent's creatures. All of their creatures have to attack, and they have to attack someone besides us. So not only will that keep us from receiving a bunch of aggro, because they literally can't attack us, but it'll also lower all of our opponent's life totals because they're going to take damage from all these creatures. If we have this down and then we play a spell like Smoke or Mudslide, then they're really restricted on what they can untap, and they can't really attack us back. Next up we have Koskin Falls. This is 2 black. It's an enchant world, that's how you know it's an old card. During your upkeep, tap target untapped creature you control, or bury Koskin Falls. Bury just means sacrifice, it's old wording for sacrifice. No creature can attack you unless its controller pays an additional 2 mana whenever that creature attacks. So this works just like Ghostly Prison or Propaganda underneath those effects, but it's in black. So in conjunction with our other taxing effects, it makes it really hard for anyone to attack us. And then, as I always say, last but certainly not least, we have No Mercy. 2 mana, black. Whenever a creature deals damage to you, destroy it. Notice how it doesn't say combat damage either, it just says damage. So that includes pinging or any kind of direct damage, whether it's a Terror of the Peaks or something like that. So now people are really not going to want to do damage to us because they'll lose their creatures. This card is super good in the deck because everyone's going to want to attack us at some point, but now they have to make the decision of if they want to lose every creature they attack us with or not. Okay, on to the next category, removal. So, first up, the Meathook Massacre. X black, legendary enchantment. When the Meathook Massacre enters the battlefield, each creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life. Whenever a creature an opponent control dies, you gain 1 life. So this is a nice flexible board wipe. We can either cast it by paying mana into X and doing -X/-X to each creature, or we can just play it for double black and get the passive ability of whenever a creature we control dies, each opponent loses 1 life, and vice versa. So there's a couple reasons why I like this card. One being, like I was just saying, it's versatile. The next being, because it's -X/-X, it gets around indestructible. There's a lot of indestructible creatures now in Commander. You gotta think of cards like Toski. There's other cards that grant indestructibility to other creatures. There's a lot of cards that give indestructible to an opponent's entire board. -X/-X means that no matter what, that card's dying unless they have some way of pumping it up, which most of the time they don't. Early game, it's good because even casting this for 4 with a -2 is still going to get a lot of stuff on the battlefield. And casting it late game is great as well because we can pump a bunch of mana in this and get rid of the entire board and still keep this enchantment on the battlefield. And of course, if we cast this late game, we get a ton of triggers with everything dying. Up next, we have Old Faithful, Chaos Warp, 2 in a red. Instant, the owner of target permanent shuffles it into their library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it's a permanent card, they put it onto the battlefield. This is a really great one-size-fits-all removal spell. It's really rare to get this kind of effect in red, especially, but definitely in Rakdos colors. This can target any permanent, so it doesn't matter if it's an enchantment, which normally Rakdos cannot target, although black kind of can now, but not really. A indestructible permanent, like we talked about with like a One Ring. Since this doesn't destroy it, it shuffles it back into the owner's library. It makes it almost impossible that they're going to draw it again. And then the downside of this card is that they get to flip the top card of their library, and if it's a permanent, they get to put it down. This does sometimes lead to an even worse card coming off the top of the opponent's library than the one that we shuffled back in, but most of the time, what ends up happening is they flip a land, or they flip some kind of mana dork, or they flip a instant or sorcery which they can't cast anyway, and then we just essentially shuffled away a big threat, and it's not coming back this game. Really versatile removal spell, super good in any deck that's running red. Next up, Richard's favorite from MTG Goldfish, Boompile. It is a 4-mana generic artifact. We can tap it, flip a coin. If you win the flip, destroy all non-land permanents. There aren't a lot of ways to do this in Rakdos. There are a lot of ways to do this in white, but we are not a white deck. With the current state of Commander, you gotta have a way to just get rid of everything on the board. We're not always gonna be able to get out to the dream start that we want, and sometimes we gotta answer multiple things and we just don't have the cards in our hand to do that. So having a way to destroy all non-land permanents kind of resets everyone back to square one, and being able to do this at instant speed and for only 4 mana if we choose to do it on the turn that we cast it is pretty good value. Now of course we gotta flip a coin, and we're not always going to win the flip. It's a 50-50 chance. But like I said, there aren't a lot of ways to do this in Rakdos, and so this is kind of what we got. I find that you can use this card as a political tool. People will either laugh at it or take it ultra seriously because they're going to lose their entire board potentially. So if someone's stressed out about this, you can just tell them, hey, as long as you don't attack me, I'm not going to activate it. And you can divert the aggro to someone else. If the whole table starts telling you, no, we're going to gun you down because we got to get rid of this thing, then you can just start activating it until you win the flip. Weird card, but necessary utility in the deck. Next up, we have Damnation, 2 black. Destroy all creatures, they can't be regenerated. Probably the best art in Magic the Gathering, but just a really good black wrath. It's the same thing as Wrath of God, just in black. Very efficient creature board wipe. Next up, we have Hagra Mauling, 2 black, instant. This spell costs 1 less to cast if an opponent controls no basic lands. Destroy target creature. There are a bunch of greedy land bases out there that don't run any basics, so this sometimes does come down as 3 mana, so it's essentially equivalent to a murder, but it's an MDFC that can come in as a black land as well, so it's just a nice versatile card in the deck. It's not our best removal spell, but it's nice to have it be a removal spell when we need it to be, or land when we need it to be. Next up, we have Fraying Omnipotence, 3 black, sorcery. Each player loses half their life, then discards half the cards in their hand, then sacrifices half the creatures they control, round up each time. So this is mainly in the deck for the first ability, where each player loses half their life, and it's round up. So this gets around the problem that Heartless Hitsugu runs into, where it rounds down. Since this rounds up, we're going to be able to kill everyone at once if we have a Wound Reflection type effect down as well. But in the scenario where it doesn't kill everyone because we don't have a Wound Reflection, causing everyone to lose half their life, then discard half the cards in their hand, and sacrifice half their creatures is a big blow to the table. And with Florian's ability, we're going to look at the top at least 30 cards of our library. It's a funky wrath, but it works with Florian really well. Next up, we have Deadly Tempest, 4 black, destroy all creatures. Each player loses life equal to the number of creatures they control that were destroyed this way. So this kind of works like Rakdos Charm in the sense that if you're playing a lot of creatures, this really hurts you. If someone's already really low on life, this can be the final nail in the coffin for them too. Next, we have Decree of Pain. This is an 8 mana wrath, 6 generic black, sorcery, destroy all creatures. They can't be regenerated. Draw a card for each creature destroyed this way. And then we can cycle it for 5 mana. When we cycle Decree of Pain, all creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. So this card is versatile. Earlier in the game, we can cycle it and get the -2/-2. Since Florian is a 3/3, it won't affect Florian, but it might kill a bunch of our opponent's stuff and sort of be a pseudo one-sided board wipe. But really the reason this card is in the deck is because if you do cast this and destroy a bunch of creatures, you can draw a ton of cards with this. So wrathing the board and then drawing a bunch of cards is pretty sweet in this deck, especially since most of our important cards in the decks are artifacts and enchantments. We don't really care about wrathing all of the creatures. And then last, but certainly not least, is Obliterate. Now, before you turn off the video, let me explain this card and why it's in the deck. So Obliterate, 6 generic red. It's a sorcery. Obliterate can't be countered. Destroy all artifacts, creatures, and lands. They can't be regenerated. Now, I'm sure you're swearing at your screen saying, why would you run this card? This is super toxic. And I don't disagree with you. This deck is super toxic. This deck is about as toxic as you can get without worrying about not being invited back to your EDH group. However, this is a finisher in the deck, and that's the only reason it's in here. The way that this deck plays out in practice is you get down all of your pingers, you deal a bunch of damage to people, you make them lose life, you get to look at the top X cards of your library with Florian, and you handpick the ones that are the most applicable for that given board state. So a lot of the times, Obliterate will be in the top X cards of my library, and I'm just not going to choose it. There's only a specific scenario that I choose Obliterate for. As we talked about before, this deck has a lot of artifacts, but a lot of enchantments as well. If we read Obliterate again, it says we destroy all artifacts, creatures, and lands. It doesn't destroy enchantments. So this card works as a finisher in the scenario that we have enough pinging enchantments down that if we were to get rid of all the other permanents, there's no way that the opponents could get out of the pain that we're inflicting on them. So this is the scenario. We have a handful of enchantments down that are each pinging our opponents every turn. If we freeze frame the board state and we got rid of everything else except for the enchantments, the opponents would just naturally die because they would have no way of getting rid of our enchantments, and our enchantments would ping them down until they lost all their life. So in that one scenario, which is rare, but it comes up every once in a while, we play Obliterate, we get rid of everything but the enchantments, and then our opponents have no foreseeable way to come out of the hole that we put them in. And to me, that is the whole essence of this deck. We've already talked about that before with some of our other cards. We're putting our opponents in a chokehold, they're between a rock and a hard place, however you want to phrase it, and they can't get out of it. But this card really puts them in a chokehold, and because it can't be countered, there's almost no way to stop this from happening. And like I said, in the actual scenario where I cast this, what will actually happen in practice is I'll say, hey, I'm casting Obliterate, this is why. In 2 turns, you're all dead anyway. And what we'll do is we'll say, GG, shuffle up and play another game. No one's going to be salty about it because I showed that there was no way for them to come back. Now, I'm sure there's some niche way that you're thinking of where this doesn't work, but I'm willing to take that risk. Of course, if someone has an effect that protects their board, like a Teferi's Protection or Heroic Intervention, then yeah, it's a blowout and I'm probably gonna die. But I'm gonna die with a big smile on my face because I got to cast Obliterate in a game of Commander. Okay, on to the next category, ramp. First up, we have Curse of Opulence, 1 red, Enchantment Curse, enchant a player. When an enchanted player is attacked, create a gold token. Each opponent attacking that player does the same. This is a super good curse in red. If you're not familiar with it, what it does is it puts a curse on one player, and then anyone attacking that player makes a gold. However, we get to make a gold for anyone that attacks that player. So we get a gold if we attack them and if someone else attacks them. Everyone wants to ramp in Commander, so everyone's going to be incentivized to attack that one player to get themselves a gold token, which is essentially the same thing as a treasure token, except it doesn't tap to sacrifice for mana, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that it gives us ramp, and then as other people attack that player, it gives us more ramp. Next, we have Dark Ritual, 1 black, instant, add black, black, black to your mana pool. It's insane how good this card is, and it's insane that it's super cheap. I think this card's like 50 cents. It's a must-have in any black deck you're running. There's a million arts for this card, but I like this one the best. Next up, Soul Ring. Don't really need to explain this card, but it's a 1 mana generic artifact, adds 2 colorless mana. Obviously, paying 1 mana to add 2 mana is super good. We don't have a ton of options for ramp and Rakdos, so usually we have to use artifacts to get that ramp, and Soul Ring is probably the best one that's legal in Commander. Next up, we have Wayfarer's Bauble, 1 generic mana artifact. We can pay 2, sacrifice Wayfarer's Bauble, search your library for a basic land, and put the card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. Any spell that takes a land out of your deck and puts it on the battlefield is super good. Obviously, green can do this in spades. Not so much in Rakdos, there are only a couple things that can do it, but Wayfarer's Bauble is one of the best. Next up, we have Arcane Signet, 2 generic mana, add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity so we can add red or black. Comes down early game, helps us ramp ahead, and the fact that it adds 1 mana of either color is just super, super good. Mind Stone, 2 generic mana, artifact, tap, add colorless mana to your mana pool, or we can pay 1, sacrifice Mind Stone to draw a card. I do like the versatility of this mana rock, which is why it's in the deck. I probably crack a Mind Stone to draw a card about half the time that I play one. It's that often that I actually sacrifice to draw that card. There's just so many times you're in the mid to late game and you have extra mana, and it's just more valuable to have that card in hand than this extra mana rock on the battlefield. So having the ability to do that is super nice. Next up, Rakdos Signet, 2 generic mana. We can pay 1 mana to tap it, and we can add black and red to our mana pool. Next up, we have Talisman of Indulgence, 2 generic mana. We can either tap it to add colorless mana, or we can tap it to add black or red. If we do, Talisman of Indulgence deals 1 damage to us. Next up, we have the Iron Crag, 2 generic mana. It's a legendary artifact. We can tap it to add colorless mana. And then there's another clause on there about turning it into an equipment, which I never do, so I'm not going to read it. But if you want, it's up on the screen. You can read it now. And then last, but certainly not least, is Nahib the Eternal. 3 generic, red, legendary creature, zombie minotaur warrior. Afflict 3. Whenever this creature becomes blocked, defending player loses 3 life. At the beginning of your post-combat main phase, add red mana for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. So just imagine all that life loss we're already causing. Now, in our post-combat main phase, which is our second main, we get to look for a card with Florian and add red mana for each life that our opponents lost this turn. So as we've talked about before, that can be as high as 30 or 40 mana. So this card is absolutely insane in this deck. Last category is the lands. We're just going to flip through these real quick. I'll tell you right now, there are 33 lands in the deck, and there are 4 MDFCs, which gives us a total of 37 lands in this deck. I typically like 38, 39, so I might play around with that number and bump it up, but so far I haven't run into an issue with that when I've played this out in the wild. But here are the lands. Arid Archway, balanced land, gives us 2 colorless mana. Ash Barrens, comes down and gives us a colorless mana, or we can basic land cycle it to get a basic into our hand. Blightstep Pathway, we can play it as a black mana source or a red mana source. Kind of works like a dual basic land where we can choose one or the other depending on what we need. Canyon Slough, it is a fetchable swamp mountain that comes into play taps and taps for either color, or we can pay 2 and cycle it from our hand to draw a card. Command Tower, taps for either color in our commander's color identity, comes into play untapped. Dragonskull Summit, comes into play untapped if we control a swamp or a mountain. Drossforge Bridge, comes into play tapped, adds black or red, is indestructible, which could come up if we cast Obliterate. Field of Ruin, destroys a non-basic land that an opponent controls, then we each get to search for a basic. Grixis Panorama allows us to search for a mountain or swamp in our deck, or comes into play and taps for colorless mana. Guildless Commons, balanced land that taps for double colorless. Rakdos Carnarium, balanced land that taps for Rakdos mana. Scavenger Grounds taps for a colorless, or we can pay 2 and exile all graveyards. Shadowblood Ridge is a filter land where we can pay 1, tap it, and add Rakdos mana. Shire Terrace comes into play, we can add colorless mana, or we can pay 1, sacrifice it, search for a basic, and put it onto the battlefield. Smoldering Marsh is a fetchable swamp mountain that comes into play untapped if we control 2 or more basic lands. Tainted Peak comes into play, taps for a colorless, or if we control a swamp, we can add black mana or red mana. Temple of Malice is a scry land, comes into play, we scry 1, then we can add black or red mana. Tramway Station comes into play tapped, we can add black or red mana, or we can sacrifice it later on to draw a card. We are playing 7 swamps and 7 mountains, but the all-star land of this deck is Glacial Chasm. If you're a commander player, you should be familiar with Glacial Chasm. It is a land that comes into play. We have to sacrifice another land. It has cumulative upkeep of 2 life, and it says all damage dealt to us is reduced to 0. So that encompasses damage from our own spells and combat damage from our opponents. So getting this card down is super good in this deck. It basically creates a situation where no matter what our opponents do, they can't deal damage to us. We don't take damage from our own spells, which sometimes deal damage to us. And now all of our damage and life loss effects are only hitting our opponents, and we're sitting here completely safe and comfortable. This is one of the reasons why I run Field of Ruin in every deck, and I'm probably going to start running more types of targeted land destruction or non-basic land destruction in my decks. There's just so many non-basic lands that need to be taken out. There's just not enough Field of Ruins to pack in your deck in order to take them all out. So that's the deck. Quick review. The point of the deck is to make our opponents lose a bunch of life, and we gain value off of that life loss. We have a bunch of spells that make it hard for our opponents to attack us or impossible to do damage to us. We can also use our board wipe package to control the board and make sure that our artifacts and enchantments take everyone's life total down to 0. I really like this deck, and here are some of the reasons why. I mentioned before that I'm a big fan of Rakdos, so obviously being in Rakdos colors tickles my fancy. I also think Group Slug is a really unique strategy that you don't see often at commander tables. Usually it's one value engine against another value engine, against some kind of combat deck, against some kind of Voltron deck. So I really feel like Group Slug throws a big wrench in the normal commander game experience. But I firmly believe it's a good wrench. I've played a lot of commander games where they've gone 3 or 4 hours, and everyone's just dirtling around and no one really wants to attack each other, and it just takes forever. One of the main things I like about this deck is it makes games super quick. Whether we win or lose is not super important, as it shouldn't be in Commander, but it makes the games really fast. Because we're putting everyone in an extreme bind by making their life total go down every turn and stripping away their resources, they have to play differently than they normally would. They can't just sit back and draw cards and send one creature at this player and next turn send one creature at that player. They really got to think about how they're going to get out of this situation. And my goal of the deck is by the time they've realized that they need to play differently, I've put them in such a bind that they can't get out of it. But it's still fun for me to see a player figure out a way to get out of it, even if that means that I lose. Because even if I get knocked out of the game, I still probably did 20 damage to each opponent. And now the rest of that game is going to go twice as fast as it normally would. So we can just shuffle up and play another game super fast. I've started to really like decks that speed the game up, and this deck definitely speeds the game up. I also really like this version of the Group Slug deck. There are other types of Group Slug decks out there where no matter what action the opponent takes, they're taking damage. Those decks are super cool too, and I really like them, but I feel like they draw way more attention than you want in a game of Commander. So one of the things I really like about this version of Group Slug is that all of the actions happen on my turn. And if you've ever played Commander, it's really easy to forget about what happened on the turn prior, or 2 turns prior. If you have a Group Slug deck that makes every action painful for the opponents, then they're constantly thinking about how you're affecting them. Like if I'm a creature deck and I play a creature and I'm taking 2 damage, and then I play another creature and I take 2 damage, my brain is automatically thinking, okay, I gotta get rid of this player. Everything I do is hurting me, and every other opponent at the table is thinking that too. But with this Florian Group Slug deck, most of the cards deal damage or make the opponents lose life during my turn. So the way that the games kind of work when I play this deck is everyone's thinking about the damage they're taking while it's being done to them during my turn, and maybe the next player is thinking about me, but then that player does some important thing that affects the board, and now everyone's thinking about that player. And we go around the circle that way until we get back to me and I do double the damage that I did on the last turn, and now everyone's freaking out, but it's usually too late by then. But because I'm not dealing damage to everyone for every action they take, it actually lets me survive a little bit longer and slip under the radar a little bit longer than the average Group Slug deck would. So if you catch me out in the wild, this is probably the deck I'm going to be playing against you, so be prepared. This is definitely my favorite deck right now. It's my go-to deck in any kind of casual game of Commander. I feel like the power level is a firm 7 if we're going by the old Commander rating. I feel like it's in that category of not powerful enough to take over the game super early on, but powerful enough to take over the game if left unchecked. So let me know what you thought of the deck. Leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you all. Maybe there's some cards out there that I haven't thought of that you think would be great in this deck. What do you think of Florian and Group Slug decks? Do you like Group Slug decks? Do you like to play against them? Do you not like to play against them? Do you like to play them yourself? What's your favorite kind of Commander deck to play? I'd love to hear all of that down in the description below. While you're there, subscribe, like the video. If you're interested, join the Discord, link in the description. Thanks for watching, I really appreciate it, and I'll see you all in the next one. Later.